tech is just going to evolve rapidly. We're all going to it's like we're all grabbing onto the tail of the tiger. It's going to move. And if we don't figure out how to push levers for good, how to define good and get those things amplified, then we're vulnerable to just like, whatever evolves at the rate that it evolves.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Deep Dhillon. Deep is an AI expert and a co-founder of Xyonix, leveraging machine learning for businesses. He also hosts Your AI Injection, a podcast where he dives into the ethical complexities and transformative power of AI, engaging with experts to explore how this technology is reshaping the world as we know it. I'm really fascinated by the development of AI. I've had a lot of people on to discuss it, but nobody who actually works in the field. And so after having met Deep in person, and we do tell that story at the beginning of the episode, I invited him to come on the show and explain what he thinks is good about AI, where he thinks it's headed, what the chatter is within the industry about it. We begin with a general conversation on technology, how the rate at which it is being introduced to society is exponentially increasing. Deep talks about the Faustian bargains that we make, and the second and third and fourth order effects of technology that we deploy that catch up with us decades later. We have a good back and forth about the economic system that we exist in, whether or not it's possible to reform it, and the impact that such a system will have on technology being produced. We then have a great chat about what people are looking for on the internet with regards to their information and the corruption of the information ecosystem, before having an excellent back and forth on whether or not the free market is actually an efficient tool to solve crises. We end with a really beautiful overview of dystopia and utopia, with Deep asking the question, what do we want society to be? And how do we make that happen? He talks about the relationship that engineers, those who build society, have to these technologies, that perhaps we need more critical thinking or more of a liberal arts education, more of a philosophical discussion in the circles of those who are making visions come to life. Whose vision is it? Who benefits? And who loses? I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Deep, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited.
I think we should tell people how it is that you're on the show, don't you?
Yeah, it was a good meeting for sure.
So we met in Granada because you were there to learn Spanish guitar and a bit of Spanish, although you didn't talk too much about your Spanish. Just mostly about the guitar. It's
not amazing, but it's less terrible than it was before. So.
And I was there visiting my cousin who was on the same course, who was at that moment a very broke master's student and who you and your wife very kindly adopted for that week.
We did. He was like our pet Fraser.
And it was just amazing because the first night that we, all met each other, essentially you and I happened to be put opposite one another at the end of the table and just absolutely had it out about AI.
I know. Fraser was freaking out. He was like, oh my God, what's happening? And it means like, I think it's okay because Deep really loves it when he gets somebody he can nerd out on global politics or something with. So, but they're like looking at each other.
They were.
This is not how polite society interacts in Seattle. Because everyone's so passive aggressive. And no, we had a great time. We were actually, and Fraser and I were all riled up because our guitar teacher had just performed a flamenco piece that night, and he's just like off the wall, amazing. It was the most spectacular show. So we're all And all of us, the fans were like, all of, the dudes in his class were hanging out afterwards. And like, so we were all riled up. And then in strolls, Rachel with her like hot pink leather jacket. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Like, what's happening?
And the opinions.
Yeah, well, the opinions were the best. So it's all awesome.
Well, let's get into it. I think obviously we could just recreate wherever it was that we started in Granada, but I want to give you the first question because I'm really, really interested in your response. So why is the world in crisis?
It's when you gave me that question, I was thinking about it. I was like, this is a weird one. I mean, I don't have the answer to this, but I think there are like two things that are sort of meta in a way that that I think are playing a pretty key role. So one of the things is the rate at which new technology and addictive stuff is being introduced into society is appearing to be on an exponential uptick. And society typically needs a good chunk of time to develop its immune response to whatever those things are, whether it's the printing press, back in the 1400s, or whether it's opium in the 1700s, or whether it's, TV in the 20s, or the internet in 93 for the most part, or whether it's social media in, 07. It just takes a while because, we've got this bottleneck, if you will, called democracy that has to kind of like think things through. And so I think that's one piece that I think is driving a lot of the feeling of us being kind of in the state of perpetual freneticism, if you will. The other thing that I think is fairly new, kind of starting with the rise of the internet, is we just have a kind of globally, and this has been true to much of an extent for much of human history, but a pretty serious extent now, which is this kind of global corruption of our information ecosystem. So we're just getting, for a myriad complicated set of factors, an environment where really it's sensationalism that's driving what media can cash in on and how they pay their bills, with a few exceptions. And that sort of drive towards sensationalism, winds up with all of us just not sharing the same reality when it comes to making decisions about things like climate and things like AI regulation or whatever topic it is. If it becomes popularized, it becomes corrupted in terms of the information we consume, and then we're just not on the same page.
Yeah, those are really, really excellent points, excellent pieces of the puzzle. And I like this idea of an information ecosystem. I have written down info system. Let's start with that, because I think you're an AI expert, but obviously one of the concerns for laymen looking in is that the system is corrupted, as you say. The information ecosystem is corrupted. The power system within technology is corrupted. And so to be building a sort of all-powerful tool on top of that corruption seems to essentially ensure a further perpetuation of that corruption, rather than be building the immune response, as you so brilliantly put it, to that very problem.
Okay, this is where we're probably going to start arguing again. Yes, I don't know how to take that, because it's like, I'm a data nerd. I sit around and deal with like really specific nuggets of stuff and like kind of build a ladder on top of it. And you're sort of with that argument building this sort of these metaphors on top, or these like generalizations on top. So I don't think I would agree with that. I think we are in the world that we're in, and it's got a set of reality nuggets, if you will, or just it is what it is. And we have to kind of figure out a way through it in a way that sort of fits on all of these systems that exist, whether it's the information ecosystem or, the capital system, the financing system or what have you. So I wouldn't phrase it quite like that. What I would phrase it is, every time we introduce transformative new technology, there's sort of a Faustian bargain that's inevitable that happens. And we don't know what the negative parts of it are up front, typically. But because they're very counterintuitive and a lot of times second or third order effects. But we do tend to know the positive thing that makes us want to adopt the technology and go crazy with it, right? So if you take I don't know, I mean, I'm old enough to remember a time when I really resisted getting a cell phone. Like I was like the last, and I was a complete nerd who spent, years just studying how information propagates, from your device to another device. But I just refused to get one. I was like, no, it's going to screw up my life. I don't want it. But at that time, the argument I always got from everyone was like, well, what are you going to do if your car breaks down? And I was like, whatever, in my early 20s. And I'm like, well, I've got my mountain bike in the back and I've done the math. And the most remote place I can possibly get stuck in is in Wyoming, where it's 250 miles to the next gas station, divided by 2. I can do that in a day and a half. I'm good. I'm just good. So that sort of thing kind of morphed into your kids need a cell phone because, they might have a problem. They need to get a hold of you. And everybody's like, yeah, they need a cell phone, right? And then fast forward to, pandemic, massive uptick in suicidal ideation amongst like teen girls, for example, just to pick one and then we started thinking, and then we had another tech influence, which was social media. So we think, oh, it was the social media. Well, it turns out it was actually a second order effect. It's the fact that kids are spending so much time on their phones, period, sort of almost irrespective of app. I mean, yes, social media has specific harms it causes, but a huge chunk of it was the loss in real-time interaction that young preteen and teens need to feel like they matter in the world. And that loss is what sort of ultimately got caused by this Faustian bargain of like, hey, if your car breaks down, you're good. You just call somebody. And now, meanwhile, we're all staring at our phones and addicted and scrolling. And I think AI is the same. It's going to be the same. The internet was the same. Like, it's just the nature of technology. I mean, even the printing, like when the written word came out, I think it was Plato. There's this kind of famous conversation where they were really freaked out that if everyone starts writing things down, that their minds are going to lose this ability to tell stories, and that their whole sort of perspective on reality is going to change. And they were freaked out about it. And it turns out they were right. Like, our reality did change quite a bit, from how we were then. And so tech has this kind of this sort of arc, if you will, where it gets introduced. We all get seduced by the positive things that whatever the tech is going to introduce. We need the positive things, or we convince ourselves that we do. And then years pass and this other stuff gets stirred up. And then there's a bunch of problems. And then society needs time to kind of evolve, adapt, and respond to it. And I think what's uniquely different in 2024 is that time to adapt and respond is just so compressed. I mean, if you look at we had thousands of years to adapt to the storage of the written word. Then we had hundreds of years to adapt to, the written word being economically accessible to the masses. And then we had tens of years to respond, to the rise of near instant global information access. And then we had a few years to respond to the rise of a device in your pocket with which made it even more intimately accessible. And in the future, there's going to be so many more things like that, people, when I talk about it, it just blows they're just, what? That sounds insane. It's like, yeah, it's going to be weird when we try to talk our 7-year-old kids into going outside. And they're like, but I'm in this immersive 3D virtual reality thing because we can't use your body's falling apart because they're in a physical thing where their bodies are working. And, it's just going to be harder and harder and harder for us to adapt in a shorter and shorter amount of time.
Yeah, the exponential sort of effect of technology is fascinating. And I think that it's exactly as you've just done, to like zoom out and really to take a look at how we have had time in the past to develop these immune responses is really, really critical, because now it just seems to be sort of getting out of hand. And I just kind of want to come back to this idea of like, if we are aware that there are Faustian bargains to be made and that there are always second order effects, and that the people who are deploying technologies are those who are making decisions that have this huge impact on the masses, then the argument of just like, well, that's just a nature of technology, it always impacts society, it sounds a little bit kind of like morally agnostic, rather than sort of taking into account the framing of like the economic system, which is built to drive capital, drive wealth to the top, and protect the bottom line, especially when we've seen that, you know, a lot of these tech companies have engaged in pretty morally repugnant behaviors at a time in order to get their products off the shelf. I'm thinking, for example, of when Meta deliberately buried the data of, you know, internally of the impact of their products on young people's mental health. This is just what's quite scary from the outside looking in. Like, these are the companies that have ballooned into these, you know, market whales with billions and billions of dollars in value and billions to play with. And they're the ones that are designing the things that are going to even further exponentially increase our relationship, and quite maladaptive relationship, to all of this technology. It's very worrying.
I would say corporations are just collections of people, right? Mm-hmm. You like, I mean, I got some friends together. I got a corporation. It's a C Corp. We do projects that we want to do in AI. And we're in the same bucket when you use the word corporation as Meta with, you know, hundreds of thousands of people. And so absolutely society needs levers to regulate, right? And influence. I would say not only regulation, but also to influence and guide. And it's interesting that you used that example. There's a lot of examples you could use with Meta. I think of the Burma example personally, where we're kind of basically like a wide scale genocide was happening, by the government, and this stuff was all just rumors flying around on Facebook, and those guys kind of got caught flat-footed. I think this is where society has to figure out not only how to like influence, guide, and regulate, but how to react faster. Like, there's different philosophies in different parts of the world in terms of how you deal with a new technology, right? Like, we don't have a global government governing entity that's functional. I mean, some would argue the UN's functional, but most would argue that it's not particularly functional. So I think despite, like, no matter how you approach it, right? Like, maybe you could argue the German government is, relatively speaking, more proactive and regulates early or the EU now relative to the US. And I think in the US, the philosophy, which I know more about, the US scenario tends to be let things evolve, identify the actual harms, and then come in, very conservatively with regulation sort of after the fact, and let the really low friction, easy access to the court system, be the gating factor. So anyone can sue anyone for anything in the States, and let that sort of system guide it. So, so an individual can sue Meta for, and in fact, I think thousands do, for social media harms. And, they have their fleet of lawyers, and you've got your fleet of lawyers that comb around looking for just the optimal victims. And that's kind of our ecosystem. It's bizarre to most of my European friends, but that's how it works. So I yes, is it scary? Yes. Is it problematic? The length of time it takes to kind of catch up to new tech? Yes. I think it is. Is it, but do I know exactly what to do? Like with respect to, let's say, AI, where I have kind of more insight? Not exactly, no. I don't think these are easy to answer questions. And I think this is one of the key points I would that I kind of forgot to make when I was talking about the introduction of new technologies is, with a few exceptions, we almost never, after with all of the knowledge of hindsight, want to go back to before, right? So when the internet first came out, I mean, I still remember sitting around in my graduate lab at the University of Wisconsin, and somebody's like, "Hey, you got to check this thing out." And this is in 1993. I'm like looking over, and we're in the computer lab, and somebody had a video up of streaming video from some source somewhere. I think it was like a balloon flying around the Berkeley campus. I was like, what the heck am I looking at? And then next thing you know, like at that time, at that instant, there were 80 websites in the world, right? And I remember thinking, this is going to be amazing. And I had this flash of like, oh, finally, like it's not going to be about these 100 editors in these newspapers that kind of determine what gets seen and read and heard. It's like democracy is going to thrive. And fast forward, 31 years, and democracy's kind of never been at more risk, I would argue, because of it. But I would have never sort of guessed that people, like, the problem would be this weird information system corruption, and that newspapers couldn't make a buck anymore. So then they had to start slinging ads. And then how do you get people to look at ads? Well, you tap into their reptilian brain and you show them salacious, or outrageous or sensational content of some form.
But is it that it's the internet that put democracy at risk? Or exactly as you said, it does seem to be, again, like the force of the economic system that we exist within, and that these technologies are created within, like, necessarily determine what they are created for. And if it is to essentially generate wealth, and wealth is seen as a sort of finite thing, which is one reason that you have to keep growing the economy all the time, allegedly, then essentially you're always like stealing from somebody else or taking from somebody else, whether that's, in the attention economy or the materials economy. And so it just, I suppose, it's deeply, again, I'm coming back just to things that worry me, but it is deeply worrying as a layman from this side who looks at sort of the connection between energy, economy, materials, and all this kind of stuff. Looking at the rise of AI, looking at the energy demands, looking at the material demands, looking at the fact that for the moment it's only really being deployed quite humorously, actually, when you look at like Google's assistant now on Google search coming up with like the most random nonsense. But the cost to society, and the cost possibly to democracy, even as it continues, like, there needs surely to be more of a discussion around the foundations upon which we are building these technologies and tools, given the risks now are surely greater than they ever were because of this corruption of our information ecosystem, because of the interconnectivity, because of the climate crisis, because of the energy crisis. Like, we can't surely keep these conversations into different silos now in a way that was possible in the past.
Well, I'm certainly not going to argue against discussion. I think we definitely need to challenge all the foundational assumptions. Sure. The challenge I have with those foundational shifting conversations is it's like a lot of uncertainty. So I don't know how, with my kind of very engineering nerdy mind, how to like forecast when sitting on that stuff. So I have to kind of draw on other examples. And so the example I would draw on is, and going back to your point about, the threat around, the information ecosystem and its linkage to the capital kind of economic basis. Well, the question I would ask is, does there exist any geographical region on Earth within which there are, differing economic systems that things are really any different? Like, would we say, for example, that China has a more accurate version of the truth, given that it has a more collective approach to wealth? Or would we say that Russia does, and personally, I would say, well, every economic system, and capital allocation system results in information distortion. The problem I have today is not that we have information distortion. We've always had it. But if you think back like 40 years ago, pre-internet really, we had maybe a few hundred global arbiters of how we saw the world. And these are like the editors of newspapers, the editors at media publications. And yeah, there was always like fringe publications, but we generally were on the same kind of page with respect to like event A happened. There was generally a common understood way to cover events. There was like a journalistic approach to documenting events. It wasn't the world we have now, right? Where those editors marginally exist, and they generally only have like significant impact in organizations where only the wealthy actually pay the $20 a month to buy their Washington Post subscription, here in the States. And, you have pockets of sanity, like I think the BBC is maybe one, but even if they are even if you had like, let's say 100% accuracy in reporting by all of the media, by the news organizations, it really wouldn't matter because people would just naturally gravitate towards the entertainment focused renderings of that news because they just don't want to hear it.
Because they just don't want to hear it.
It's just not as fun. Like, would you rather listen to the McNeil-Lehrer report, which is like this for those, who aren't in the US, we have a partially government funded entity, NPR. And there's this really boring, report that's informationally like dense and really adhering to high quality journalistic standards from the early 70s. And they haven't really changed much. And, their ratings are capped where they're capped. And it's not more than maybe, I would guess, a percentage or two of the population, consumes news this way. Or would you rather watch, Jon Stewart or whatever the other, like the comedic renderings of the news on the left or in our right, you have the right version of that are very entertainment and bombast driven, like people like Alex Jones talking about how, Hillary Clinton smelled like sulfur because she was the devil and like just weird stuff. It's just way more interesting, right?
Yeah. But I think,
for a non-factual mind, right? You're 8 in the morning,
because I think also the rise of podcasting as a genre and like the exponential sort of increase in podcasting as a media form, I think it's the only media form that's continuing to like grow, where film, TV, document, everything else is falling because people have really taken to long form discussion. And similarly with Substack, everybody was like, news is dying, don't write long articles, don't make it information dense. And enough journalists were like, this is bollocks. This isn't what I trained for. This isn't what I want to do. And they've really proven that wrong as well. So I guess I've got no data on this, but I suppose those two examples give me a little bit of faith in just how hungry people are for information. And I think the difference between like sort of old school journalism, old school long form journalism, and then what podcasting and like Substack are doing today is that there is more of that human element. Like journalists are now invited to give their opinion because a lot of journalists eventually, you spend 20 years on a beat, you kind of become an expert in and of it, in your own right, which you weren't really allowed to be in the past. So I think that people are looking to build, I think people really often now are using the internet to try and build relationships. And if you listen to somebody's voice every week, or if you read, somebody's style, their own newsletter every week, then you begin to build a relationship and you begin to increasingly validate or trust the information that's being given. And I think that's because of the corrupted ecosystem. I think that's because now you pick up a paper and you're like, well, who edited this, or who is being, who are the advertisers in this paper? What's the connection? I mean, certainly in the United Kingdom, like, what's the connection between this star journalist and, the current MPs or industry leaders? So I think that, I've got a little bit more faith in people's capacity for fact. But I agree, if not for entertainment, there has to be it has to be connected to them personally.
I think that's a really good point, right? Like, I think we're wandering pretty far from the AI, which is and definitely far from my area of expertise. So at this point, this is just like how I'm reacting to what you're saying. Yeah, but okay, I think people are lonely in the modern world. And probably nowhere more so than in Canada and the US, which is kind of the two places that I kind of know, the more. And but even in Europe, you see this, and I think you see it all over the world. Like everywhere I've traveled, there's an isolation that comes from putting social relations through a digital medium, right? And you mentioned podcasts and the relationship stuff, and I think I agree. Like I remember during COVID, I was like roaming around in the mountains alone a lot during COVID, like either on my bike or on my snowboard, and so I just started listening to a lot of podcasts, and you do feel like somebody, and you get kind of into their worldview in a way that that you don't with a byline in a short article, right? But I think there's a danger in people's inability at large to be careful about sourcing and to know how to source well, because someone that rises on the internet to be a really popular podcaster is almost inevitably and by definition going to be, a good influencer, right? Like they can influence, they can like seduce you into believing their worldview. And I think the problem comes not from, and I don't want to throw this all in the credentialing world, because I don't think that's it. I think the problem is in these echo chambers. Like when you start getting, it's twofold. It's like, one, the algorithms are shoving us in deeper into these echo chambers. And so we're in our own little worlds. Even if that's just the world of one or two or a handful of podcasts and a few Reddit threads or whatever, but we wind up in these little churny worlds. And the other part that's missing is that we're not getting the establishment perspective the way that we used to.
Yeah.
So we don't actually know, like whenever I get into I get kind of into a discussion with somebody about some kind of rando perspective, Russia had every right to invade Ukraine. I'm like, what? Like, something like that. And then, but it'll link back to a little echo chamber that's got tons of, FSB money in it at some point. And these guys are like swirling around in there, and they're coming out and throwing these arguments. And I'm like, did you check the source on that? Because I'm pretty sure it was like RT.com, and people don't know how to like triangulate. They don't know how to check sources. And I'll be honest, like, I feel like I know how to do that well. And it can be really hard to figure out what's actually going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure you feel that because you're.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's like the amount of, how do you even check a source now as well? Because like web pages can be fake, or videos can be fake, like literally videos of people's faces. Not quite well enough to the point where they can totally dupe you, but we're probably a couple of months away from that now, given like the rate of.
I think they can totally dupe you.
Oh, really?
Sure.
Now? Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Like, do you know how we actually tell when they're deep fakes?
No.
Okay, so and I don't know that this is the state of the art right now, but but a few months ago, I was chatting with a researcher who their approach was near state of the art at the time. But what you're doing is so the human body pumps blood through it, and that blood, if you look at like one pixel on the forehead, will follow the cyclicality, like the cyclical response of the blood being propagated. And that's what the signal they're looking for.
That's how you tell if it's real.
Mm-hmm.
A pixel
and
pumping
a human
blood.
can't do that. Yeah. A human can't detect. Well, I mean, some humans might be able to in some circumstances, but it's like, think about the rate at which your blood is pumping blood. And that's got to manifest itself, in pixels on your face. but it's just an and it's also ephemeral, right? It's just because the deep fakes haven't accounted for it yet. But as soon as they do, boom, that one's gone, and we're on to the next part of the cat and mouse race.
Deep, can I ask? I think deep fakes are a really, really good example of this. Like, why? Why bother? Who was like, do you know what we should do? Do you know what we should do, guys? We should be able to take a picture of somebody's face and make a video that is exactly like, what possible benefit could that have had?
You want to know what the legit economic benefits are? What? So I don't know about all.
Yeah,
there actually are a lot. Like, and we did a deep dive for a client on this, and so there's a few. Okay, so one is Hollywood, right? They spend billions on taking actors, putting them in bodysuits, doing involved motion capture, putting like sensors all over the face. So if they're going to make, like a Pixar movie, or Pixar's a good example, but like another one would, like wherever there's like animation of an actor kind of projected into a virtual character, big bucks. So Hollywood's a huge driver, because not all the money is in blockbuster films that can afford to put, $100 million, plus budget into a film. So there's all this like, long arc content that gets generated that's where they're trying to drive the cost down. And so imagine, you got a funny looking actor that's awesome at facial expressions, and now you put Scarlett Johansson's face on top, and like, boom, you do it for free. You got yourself a whole bunch more content. She doesn't even have to do the acting. She just has to have her team approve, the scripts or whatever, right? Yeah. So that's one example. The other example, which I think you'll love, is like the 3-letter agencies are trying to.
What are they?
Basically, so like CIA, like secret spy stuff. So you're meeting up with somebody from, region of the world X, right? And you're going to meet them on Skype or whatever. So you're going to put your white dude from Iowa, like in there, like it's not going to fly, blonde hair, blue eyes, like not going to work, but you morph it through. It's great. No worries.
Oh my God.
And then the last example that's driving it is like all that, metaverse crap. So, which
has failed for now.
No, nothing that gets that kind of cash, you can't write it off forever. Like that stuff's happening. It's just not happening in the way that Zuckerberg kind of thought it was going to happen. But it's happening. We're all going to be, our great grandkids we'll be lucky if they spend 5 minutes outside.
Oh, stop. Well, I mean, okay, but maybe this will definitely be another point where we disagree, because I don't think that world is going to exist where or if it does, it will only exist for a very tiny percentage of the population. Like if you just look at how sort of like politics are fracturing, the material demands of such an high intensity technological society, the population continuing to increase, the fossil fuels essentially running out around the world. Like if we had unlimited access to materials, then I would have no doubt that is the trajectory, because nothing is essentially stopping us. But we don't have unlimited access to those materials. And also the geopolitical fault lines are shifting now, thanks to, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia, that are really seeking to kind of topple US hegemony, where a lot of this tech is sort of being deployed at a huge rate. So it's one of the things that certainly in my echo chamber is discussed quite regularly, like that kind of high tech world is absolutely terrifying, but it's quite unlikely to happen. Like the Earth might take care of that one.
I think it already exists.
Okay.
It's already here. I mean, I have a friend who's sold their company to Google 14 years ago. And all they did, this is 14 years ago, I think 2012, something like that, 12 years ago. All they did was operate as a currency exchange inside the game between gaming environments. So World of Warcraft, like I don't even know the games because I'm like, that's how much I could care less about video games. But that's all they did, right? The money flowing through their economy was greater than the entire nation of Holland at the time.
Wow.
And it was on an exponential uptick. They had like tons of companies that were like arbitraging, and I mean companies, like not just like one person, but like actual companies were forming where people were buying and arbitraging real estate assets. So either real estate in quotes, because it's all virtual, but you buy a sword from here, you sell it there. And we all know about like I have a good friend of mine, met his wife in World of Warcraft like 20 plus years ago across continents. I don't know. He was like an eagle or a warrior dude, like, whatever happens in those worlds. And one day, and this is, their whole living room is just like it's like they don't have a normal living, it's just like TV screens everywhere. And every aspect of socialization happens through that, in his world and in his friends, all of whom ironically are like really social in the real world, which was super surprising. But he's like, yeah, we've got boom mics. We're in a 3D world. We're running around like hunting monsters or whatever. They're spending all their time in there and have for decades. And I mean, I remember like when I was in school in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, we had these VAX systems like underground on our campus. And we had all these, we used to call them tunnelers, but these dudes who just lived in the tunnels and played like immersive distributed video games. And that's all they did. They would drop out of school and just live down there. And we had like World War II era rations down there because there was like a bunch of DoD research. And so there was like, there were like these gallons of like peas and like corn. But there was like tens of like thousands of these things. And they would just like that. They just ate that stuff and lived down there. And I don't know, like that's all they did. And that was in like late 80s, early 90s. There's a lot of people who don't want to interact in the physical world, whether for disability or just because they think this other world's more interesting.
Yes, of course. And I'm definitely not an advocate of getting rid of all technology. I love the technology that I use. I wouldn't be able to do my job without it. And I think, your point to disability is really well made as well. For some people, it allows them access to a world that otherwise they wouldn't. I suppose the point more that I'm making is that, and I'd be very interested to know what kind of discussions are happening in Silicon Valley around, the hard limits to growth or hard limits to material access or even hard limits to energy. Because it's something that policymakers are worrying about, it's something the military is worrying about, it's something that a lot of academics are worrying about. But it doesn't, I don't know, but certainly it's not making headlines with regards to, the concern of AI driving up energy consumption to the extent that, it has to get sacrificed elsewhere.
I mean, I think certainly there's an understanding that AI is going to suck down a lot of power and that the public utility grid is probably not going to be sufficient. So this is why you're seeing, tons of money going into new energy startups that can like make encapsulated distributed power generation, whether that's a bunch of like solar panels or isolated wind tunnels, but all the way down to nuclear, even nuclear fission, like old school and nuclear fusion reactors. And my personal prediction is that that's a good thing. And this is like a counterintuitive belief, but I think when the people who know better than anyone how to make new, hard to make stuff, know that they must make their own power, then we will get economically like we're going to get huge jumps in economic efficiency around power creation. The challenge is when you monopolize it, which we did 100 plus years ago, put it all in the hands of the government, regulated the crud out of energy production that we wound up seeing like, a major like gating factor in terms of how much power could be generated. But I think it's, less than a decade, we're going to see massive output on clean energy, like just massive, because there's $1 trillion+ going into this. Like it's a big, big deal, and it's going to get solved. It might not hit all of us directly, but it will definitely power the AI that's needed. So let me put it that way.
That's
because they're just
statement.
flat out getting turned down, right? Like like when you try to put in, a million, 10 million GPU, installation somewhere, and you go to your whatever, Oregon, New Jersey, pick your state, pick your country in Europe, and you say, hey, we need like whatever 250 megawatts today and like a gigawatt tomorrow. They're like, yeah, no, because you're now integer multiples of the public, and they're like, we're not doing that for you. You guys figure it out.
I'm not sure if there is an argument to be made for the free market getting involved in industry, thus driving economic efficiency. Yeah.
You're saying there isn't an argument for that?
I am. I don't think there is. I think when you...
Okay.
Yeah, because...
Say more, because my instinct is like I'm totally not on page, but like keep going.
Well, the example that comes to the top of my head would be the fossil fuel industry, which is privatized around the world, apart from in a handful of countries that thus have economic sanctions on them, namely by the United States. And it is subsidized to the tune of trillions around the world from governments, to the extent that if you were to take away those subsidies, it would make a net loss. So there's no sort of economic advantage, like no pure economic advantage to the fossil fuel industry. But it's that it's like that part of the market, or the energy market, is so tightly bound up with existing power structures and in existing political power structures, that's sort of why it's continued to be subsidized and facilitated. It's a huge centralization of power. And so whilst I agree that diversifying the energy supply is excellent, that getting more creative minds on how do we solve this problem, on creating a network of energy systems would also make it more resilient, et cetera, I don't think that we do have really an example of that resulting in economic efficiency because of the connection between the economic markets and the power markets. And when I say power, I mean political. Because if you look at like 100 years ago, when solar panels were first being deployed and were being deployed at an exponential rate and were about to take over fossil fuels, that guy disappeared. If you look at, the invasions in the Middle East over the past few years, which have typically been done under the guise of democracy and freedom and bloody whatever, it's normally been to get access to resources. Even if you look at the sourcing of materials for the clean energy system that we all need now in Europe and in the United States, essentially in the global north, rainforest is being ripped up, indigenous people are being dispossessed of their lands, and there's a huge amount of pushback. So the free market is not insulated from the existing power structures in the world. It's fundamentally integrated into it. And so I don't think that deploying the free market that also has an economic incentive that is not about distributing what people need to them, but is about protecting a bottom line and increasing available profit. I don't think that then dictates economic efficiency or results in economic efficiency.
Okay, I think we're probably using economic efficiency in maybe in slightly different ways.
Okay.
So in your fuel case, I would argue that that all of that private capital that went into extracting fossil fuels did result in cheaper gas at the gas station.
Okay.
But hence more efficient. Like, in other words, if I'm down there with a shovel pulling oil out of the ground with a tube and a hose, I'm going to only be able to get so much oil out of the ground. And therefore, if I have like a less automated way of, like munging it to get it into gasoline and get it into your tank, it's just going to cost more. That said, your point about all of the power players and politics and geopolitics around fossil fuels is real and really does distort markets. So I would say that economic market is much more distorted by, for lack of a better word, power politics than the argument I would make would be like for economic efficiency being driven by private interests would be like, just look in your pocket. I mean, in your pocket right now is way more compute resources than the biggest supercomputers not very long ago. Mm-hmm. Like not very long ago at all. Mm-hmm. And that's, that all happened because so like, in my universe, VCs invest, engineers choose to build things. Usually there's one law that kind of governs all of them, and it's Moore's law. It's the cost of whatever at scale is just going to keep dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping because all the different parts of the supply chain and the ecosystem are just going to get more and more and more and more and more and more efficient until we hit some law of physics that stops it. So if you think about the cost of silicon and like, a microprocessing unit, and how many transistors you can shove inside of a chip, like that's been following Moore's law for, it followed it for decades until eventually we sort of hit up against the bounds of the physics that let us put so many transistors into a particular unit. And then we started, just adding more, CPUs or GPUs or CPU cores into systems. So we kind of hit a limit there. And I'm arguing that like with respect to power generation, a similar thing will happen. Like if you look at nuclear power costs a lot because, I'm not at all arguing that you don't need to regulate nuclear power. 1,000,000% you need to regulate the crud out of nuclear power because we all know the terrible things that can happen with it. But I think we went a little bit too far, in starting in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, which ultimately created this, climate problem that we have. If we had all gone the way of France and had like nuclear power proliferated, we might have blown each other up or contaminated the earth, but we wouldn't have global warming. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think France is a very good example of going against the status quo and kind of lucking out. Shame they will go down with the rest of us because it's a planetary crisis. But I just want to kind of highlight one thing that you said, that this image of you with a shovel and a tube pulling up oil versus a corporation, because there's also like secret option number 3, right? Which is a cooperatively owned, participatory decision-making led, organization that is owned by the workers for the workers. That would be a sort of classic Marxist thing. Or, the state would pull its finger out and actually do its job, which it should be able to, given the amount of resources available to it. Like, there doesn't have to be this drive of private incentive to make things happen. There can also be a drive of collective incentive. And like, yes, I have this amazing computer in my pocket that I am dependent on for directions and, my train tickets and staying in touch with my family. And it allows me to be far away from the people that I love, which even though I love them, I'm super grateful for. And yet it also comes with all of this host of second, third, and fourth order effects, exactly as you said, that we as a society didn't ask for. And maybe even we should be questioning like this use of the word society or democracy when we exist in such a corrupted information ecosystem. Because there is an element, I think, of like members of the public just having to keep up with private incentives then the private incentives are to generate more profit. And we are kind of forced into a situation whereby if we want to exist as a member of that society, we are forced to adopt certain technologies. Like, it is very, very, very hard to exist without a cell phone now if you want to have a corporate job, because you need to be available to answer your emails at kind of all hours of the day. It is increasingly hard to go into a bank and actually speak to somebody now because it's all online banking. If you want to travel a lot, good luck without a cell phone today. So I feel like there is this element of And I'm about to use the word conspire, and I don't mean it in a conspiratorial way, because I do believe that the people at the top, the VCs, the engineers, whatever, people making those decisions also exist within the same system, whereby they are trying to keep up with the direction of travel, essentially. But it is almost like the economic, energy, material, all of the system that we exist in is like conspiring, essentially, to create situations whereby we are forced to adopt technologies that happen to, or that create, an increase in bottom line for the few people that have access to relatively, autonomous decision making, which, even if you take a look at it, isn't really autonomous at all. And the point of all of that was, what was the point of all of that? The point of all of that was, that's why I don't think the free market exists.
I mean, it certainly feels like we're all on a treadmill, right? Like it feels like this is an engine that's just ticking and churning and going somewhere.
Yeah.
And I would argue that there's probably few of us that are psyched about the place that we think it's going.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also argue that there's lots of us that think it could go somewhere good. And I think this is where maybe we jump into the philosophical realm for a moment. We should sit down you mentioned like, what's the discussion you think we should, that we should have. I think there's a discussion that we don't have that we should have, which is, what do we want society to actually be? In a world where machines can do the vast majority of stuff that we already, that we currently spend time doing, right? So in a world where we don't have to be running around making a buck, and that world's coming pretty quickly. What do we want everyone to do? Like, and I'm a bit of I'm a realist, but occasionally I have like accidental sparks of optimism. So but I think so for example, a lot of the Valley, is, I mean, this shouldn't be a secret, but it's basically driven by sci-fi stuff, right? What somebody writes a book, everybody gets obsessed with it. Silicon Valley spends 10 years and realizes that vision largely, right? So Neil Stephenson wrote this book called The Black Sun, I think it was called. No, Black Sun was like a club inside of the book. Snow Crash. The book was called Snow Crash. And, and it just described this like kind of crazy, sci-fi world where everybody, was like hackers were like logging on to this network, and these people would like kind of jump in and there were these 3D worlds, and they had these online identities, but then in the offline world, they were like hiding their tracks and covering them up. And there were like, places to hang out in this online world. And it was like, it was this immersive 3D environment where you could kind of go in there and walk around and like meet people in there. And, this book comes out, and I don't remember the exact timeline, but a few years later, like $1 billion+ goes into immersive 3D reality. This was back in the kind of mid 90s, like 1995-ish timeframe. Goes into like a fleet of startups. Everybody's making startups because they're like, Internet version 1 was like 2-dimensional. Internet version 2 is going to be 3-dimensional. That was the thesis. So, I got sucked into it for a few years. Everybody built stuff. We were like meeting in these. I remember like at one point in my career, this is probably like 93, 94. I'm a disembodied head with like talking lips in a 3D world, meeting with a physically trained physical architect who's now morphed himself into a virtual architect who architects virtual worlds, meeting with a Hollywood producer person and we were like designing this world, and we'd meet inside of this thing. So this stuff's been around, I forgot where the heck I was going with this.
What do we want society to be?
Yeah. So at that time, like I thought what I wanted society to be, because I was, just enamored with this is what I think is part of the problem. And I think you've definitely honed in on this. Like engineers just want to build stuff they've been reading about that seems fantastical, right? And I just got sucked into wanting to build this 3D immersive space. I didn't think it would actually happen. Like, I just thought I wanted it. And similarly with AI, like, I've just been obsessed with this idea that like machines, that we can teach machines to learn the way a human does. Most of us didn't really stop and think like, what's the world that comes out of that? We just follow it because it's like simple intellectual curiosity combined with the ability to pay for a mortgage, you know, like that's it. But I think there are some sci-fi that's not a dystopia, that's kind of more utopian in some ways. And so like, you know, I'm a fan of Star Trek, the Star Trek series, and I hate most sci-fi, but I love Star Trek for some reason. And I think like underneath it all is this like, yes, there's this very complicated universe that's evolving and multiple universes in this Star Trek world. But kind of inside of it all or beneath it all is this like inherent kind of, I would even argue collectivist in some ways, like it's like a post-money society, but it's very technologically driven. But ultimately, you know, they run into worlds where everybody's just sitting around making pottery and like, you know, and like, you know, but then they also run into other worlds where there's like dark characters running around killing everybody. But I think underneath it all is like a positive vision of humanity, like progressing. And I feel like, I don't know that that's the reality I want, but I can tell you that people in the Valley are following, you know, a vision of humanity ultimately not living in biological bodies, living on, you know, in machines. And so we can colonize the universe that way. Like, and whether it happens or not, I don't know. I don't live that far into the future, but they're certainly trying to make it happen.
Yeah. I've had a couple of people on to kind of talk about this dematerialization and like the myths and the myths and beliefs that have kind of like founded it and some really, really interesting stuff. And it is, to me, I think you can make an argument that kind of goes back to Plato and this like separation, you know, of the material form and then the eternal forms and the earth being a profane place. That's Carl Safina's argument that I really ascribe to. And whilst, you know, gun to my head, sure, benefits, no doubt there's benefits living in a machine over a biological body. But I just don't think that that's how it's meant to be, poetically, metaphorically. And again, I do think that this really kind of, how do I put this? I almost want to use vulnerable, but, you know, this really insightful thing that you've said about like, you know, engineers want to build a thing that they are fascinated by and maybe don't stop to think about kind of the second and third and fourth order effects, the Faustian bargain that they're making, or that they are forcing others then to make with the help of all of these like mechanisms of system dynamics, essentially. Then that is really what we need to be getting at. Like, what is the philosophy behind all of these technologies? How is it being deployed to help people? Because people really, really, really need help. We've got far more vulnerable people and species in the world than we do privileged or even safe as a, you know, a good and sort of surely legally right bottom line. And I think that there's a lot of possibility in co-designing society. But when you have the information ecosystem, not just corrupted, but rotten in the way that it is, when you have bloated power sitting with few people who are not as autonomous as they are often made out to be in the kind of like villainous characterization of certain executives or whatever, because ultimately they exist within the same reality that we do and they have to make certain decisions in order to maintain their position, yada, yada, yada. Within that structure, there is a fundamental limit to engineers achieving utopia. Like, we can't engineer our way out of a dystopia. And I think we can argue that we live in a pretty dystopian world. Like, we also have to kind of ideologically shift. And I do find the dematerialization like a really fascinating mirror, essentially, of like that desire to escape reality, because it's not that great. Like the biological organism breaking down, kind of like how the planet is breaking down, kind of like how all of our ecosystems are breaking down and communities are breaking down and societies are breaking down and politics are breaking down. And rather than everybody like stopping, just for a second, stopping and being like, right, rather than there is nowhere to escape if the planet goes on fire and drowns and, freezes over and dries up all at the same time in different parts of, the continents. We are going to have to find a way through. I do find it really interesting that the response in the valley has been, well, I'll just escape the body then as well. It's like we all, like the house is on fire. We all know the house is on fire.
I don't mean to imply that everybody thinks this way, but like
Sure.
it's certainly, it's definitely a line of thought that people have. I think you're right? Like this maybe to like kind of come full circle here. So you might have sensed I'm not a tear down the global economic order thinker. I feel like there are enough levers in our kind of democratic, Western societies to pull, but we have to choose to pull them. And we have, I would argue, in many ways started to pull them. And so you said something else that I want to kind of riff on. You said, like, we can't engineer our way out of dystopia. I'm going to riff on that and say we must engineer our way out of dystopia, and that we can. And I would start with how we invest. So when we put money into companies, and which are just people, we're just determining who to give money to. And when we do that, we should ask ourselves, like, to what end? And I think you're starting to see this sort of thinking manifest itself in a big way, right? So like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, this is something that I kind of came to learn of recently, and maybe you know a lot more about it, and I'm sure you probably know the dark side of this because I barely scratched the surface. But like this is like the nation of Norway has a ton of oil. People don't realize it, but I think they're the world's second largest producer of oil or something. And unlike the rest of the oil producing world, they're actually like economically sensible. So they like take all this money, they put in this ginormous fund because they know the oil is going to run out or not be worth much, and then they invest it. And I think the number I saw was something like 5% of major like S&P 500 companies' investment comes from the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. So the fund apparently decided to like mandate that all of their money must and I don't like must like anywhere they invest has to like do this like sustainability thing where they like track multiple aspects of sustainability. And they started with just tracking. And so when like in the States, we have all these, that folks on the on the right side of the political aisle are really against this. I think it's called ESG. Tell me about it. You know all about it. So, and I'm sure all your listeners do too. But like, my point is not that I know about this stuff because I really don't know about it a ton. But people with capital have the ability to determine how they invest that capital. And I would argue that the people with capital, and it's not only capital, it's also time, right? So you're either investing because you're a billionaire and you want to invest, or you're investing because you're an employee. And all the high tech firms share one thing in common, that their employees own a massive chunk of the companies. So this is why you do get change in a Facebook or whatever, is because there's tens, hundreds of thousands of employees that don't really feel the exact same way that Zuckerberg does, and they make that very well known. And so they have to change. And this is the reason that Amazon is going full tilt green. It's not because Bezos wanted to originally. It's because the employees push. So people have different levers they could push on. People have varying levels of influence, which is, I think, what your problem with the current system is that we don't all have an equal say. Personally, I don't want us to all have equal say, but like that's not for the reasons that you probably think. It's more because I think the more you know about something, you should have a more impact than. But in any event, my point is like we can choose how to invest our time. We can choose how to invest our money. Yesterday, I had somebody on my podcast for my company, and it was a guy that works for a company that basically leverages AI to very rapidly diagnose diseases. They can't use the term diagnose, but to identify problematic disease states And so he gave this example of, people come in, they're having a stroke. There's, a queue of human radiologists that in the States costs, I think, between $700K and $1 million a year plus. So there's a limited pool of them. They have a queue of what they can look at. So stuff has to pass a bunch of bars to get to the top. And if the machine can just automatically say, nope, this is a big deal, it can automatically grab a bunch of people, save their life, intervene. I think all of us would agree that's a good thing.
Yeah.
The doctors are still totally in charge. It's just that like an alert went off that was louder than it would have been. That's an example of a bunch of investors, a few founders, a bunch of employees, a number of clients inside of hospitals that were sort of future facing, and actually increasingly government entities that are like forcing hospitals to adopt the system because it's saving so many more lives, that are doing the right thing. They're making the world a better place. And there's no shortage of the opposite that we can grab, where there's investors just trying to make a buck, sticking stuff into like yet another gaming thing or whatever. I pick on gaming and people get pissed at me for it, but like, I just think it's a gigantic waste of time and energy. But like, hey, I'm willing to veg out in front of Netflix at times, so I can't judge it too much. But I think like we have to ask ourselves, how can we amplify those levers for good so that we can like push more money, more time, more energy into the good realizations? Because I personally think the tech is just going to evolve rapidly. We're all going to it's like we're all grabbing onto the tail of the tiger. It's going to move. And if we don't figure out how to push levers for good, how to define good, how to like, and get those things amplified, then we're vulnerable to just like, whatever evolves at the rate that it evolves.
I agree with you. I think that along the medical lines, I think I saw a thing recently as well that like there's some program that looks like it's going to be able to identify, cancerous cells before they're even there, essentially. Like something else happens in your matter before that. I'm totally for that. What I'm not for are those kinds of technologies existing within a privatized market that undoubtedly would ensure that, for example, the materials that are needed to create that computer or that, all of the different bits that you will need to create that kind of algorithm will come from a place that doesn't have the money to be able to afford that technology. So they are never going to see essentially the benefits for the technology for which their earth and their land was ripped apart. If we could also if we could engineer a new economic system, or if we could engineer a new even political system where it's not the people that with sort of this bloated amount of access to money and power that are making these decisions and making these calls, but actually like even the people sort of working on them. Because there are lots of fascinating intellectual problems that need to be solved, like the climate crisis, engineers, lots and lots and lots of really fascinating intellectual problems that need to be solved. But they're not, because there is more money in other things that essentially maintain the status quo for as long as possible, that will allow people to continue to extract value from the earth and from labor. I would love to see a world in which like engineers went on strike and said, we're not going to build this thing, actually, because we thought about the second and third and fourth order effect. Similarly,
that happens. I mean, like all the engineers at Google said, we will not work on AI for weaponry in DoD.
Great.
And Google had to back out.
Great.
So, I mean, it happens. But yeah, I mean, engineers are not big unionized folks because, we tend to get large paychecks the second we graduate. So,
yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I didn't know about the Google engineers, but just that kind of power, and that kind of society then forming whereby there is more of a collective decision-making process happening. And it is the people who know the most. Because in that example, it is the engineers know way more than the VCs and are able to forecast in a way that VCs won't be able to, and in a way that VCs wouldn't be interested in.
They're able to if they choose to. But there's cultural reasons why that doesn't always happen, and it goes back to what I was saying about like us geeks like to build stuff because it's hard.
Yeah.
And that is generally the governing principle.
Yeah.
Like it often doesn't go much beyond that. And that goes back in part to our training, but yeah, there's a token amount of a liberal arts education that an engineer gets, at least in the States, but it's really a token amount. For the most part, we are trained to solve a problem that was given to us, and they're usually hard. So,
and that's fascinating.
And there's usually like just an arse, like somebody's like shooting a machine gun at you of new problems to solve. So, yeah, I think, I think this is right. Like, kind of just to kind of pull on the thread a little bit about the healthcare scenario that I posed, that you said like, hey, is this even going to get to the third world? And I think part of what happens in our sort of economic system is we don't always understand the bargain that actually exists, right? So with respect to the healthcare thing, it used to be that if you wanted to try out a new drug, you would go to the third world and you try it out on a bunch of people, and everybody decided that's totally exploitative. We're not going to do that anymore. Or I don't know if everybody decided, but like it got decided in the Western world that like, yeah, we can't just like take our most dangerous drugs and go test them out on some poor, villager in whatever, India or Africa or something. And so then we decided, well, okay, so we have this kind of really robust set of ethics and ethical review boards that determines like, a step by step process for getting something like an algorithm to decide whether you're having a stroke and what severity it is, and what to do about it into place. Not an easy process. The FDA has spent probably the last 8-10 years trying to figure out how to even whether even to approve these algorithms and how and in what context. But suffice it to say, it's extremely well regulated. Like it's not easy to get an AI algorithm that has any impact on anyone's health for anything. It's a multiple years process, quite frankly, as it should be. And it's not just about that algorithm. It goes deep into the processes of the organization and how they go about developing that model and all that stuff. And then once it gets deployed, it doesn't typically just get rolled out to like 5,000 hospitals. And, it goes through, there's like R&D hospitals that tend to be like more forward looking, that tend to publish, and they're like, okay, we're going to try this out in a limited capacity. We're going to make sure that absolutely nothing that comes out of these algorithms gets past, any, doctor without a rigorous review process. All that stuff happens. And then at some point it's deemed safe and effective. And then boom, it starts rolling out. In the case of the West, like usually, like in the States, it starts propagating, but sometimes like in other places that are like Singapore or like Dubai or something where there's like, kind of Western standards, but like lower regulatory burdens. And then at some point it becomes sort of, during this entire time, ideally costs are being driven down. And then this company at some point decides, oh, it's worthwhile for me, to go into Zambia or wherever, with the solution. And so whether we like it or not, there's this bargain that's been struck that says the West gets great state-of-the-art medicine, and then at some time thereafter, everyone else gets it. And we saw this with the COVID vaccine rollout. Like it started off, the West, we got the Moderna vaccine, first, and then, and shortly thereafter, and it rolled out fast, but then.
I'm sorry, I just need to come in there because it's like there's a little thing that happened that's really, really important, which is that for the first time in sort of political history, the world was in agreement that we should put everything in COVAX, which was essentially this like global fund, which would have money and patents and it would be open access and everything would be done collectively.
Yeah.
And then Bill
they
Gates,
ignored it.
yeah, and then that was on the advice of Bill Gates, who is, the biggest single donor to the WHO, and went, you shouldn't do it this way, you need to privatize it. And then it was public money that created a private vaccine. And it means that there are still corners of the world that have not had access to this, even though we, the public, paid for it. The patents.
Is that true? Are there places that still haven't done it?
Yes. Yeah. So it's not inevitable that everybody gets these things just because the West.
No,
but
first. That's actually my point, though, is that process of like what I'm describing as the bargain, if you will, is that the West takes the risk, puts in the capital, gets it first, and then eventually it gets to everyone. That's the sort of de facto state of affairs. And that should be made transparent I'm not saying it's right. I'm not at all saying it's right, but it's the de facto state of affairs. And we should sort of challenge that and be like, is that right? Because it's evolved for whatever reason that it's evolved. And absolutely, we should be sort of figuring out like, well, why is it that that's there? And how can we actually make something that's more equitable, that actually functions and works, but at the same time preserves that, that drive for innovation that I think was really needed in that particular case.
Because the West maybe takes like the capital risk, but it's not taking the risk with regards to like destroying their own ecosystems. Like probably only like fossil fuel production and maybe the paper and pulp industry. But generally speaking, like, yeah, it's the West that fronts up the money and then goes and like takes from the majority world essentially to ensure that this thing goes through. So like the risk is relatively evenly distributed, but the profits or the benefit or whatever is absolutely not. And even with regards to kind of the things that are having a huge impact now on a planetary scale, including increasingly is looking like AI, just because of the sort of jump in power surge that will continue to exponentially grow.
Yeah, I mean, certainly how we distribute resources and wealth in the absence of an effective global government is problematic, right? Like we're largely living in the descendant of the British Empire.
Yeah. Yes.
Like like post World War II, this new global world order got created, largely by by Britain and the US and the Allied powers. And that global order, while not even fully accepted even in the US, which is the beneficiary of it, largely, it's just not really accepted everywhere. And none of those institutions have really become super effective. And there's a million reasons why not. But ultimately, it comes down to that we don't all just get along. Like we have real issues with each other. And it's not just a West and the rest. It's poles of power. There's, the Russian pole of power. There's the Chinese pole of power. There's the kind of Indian pole of power. And then there's NATO and the West. Yeah. And it's just, we don't agree, Yeah. So we can't get to that thing really very well. So then we try to compartmentalize on what we can agree on, and we usually can't even agree on that.
I mean, that sounds like a really good engineering problem, doesn't it? How do you get everybody on the same page?
How do you get everyone to agree when you don't agree?
Yeah. Deep, I mean, listen, I could sit and speak to you all evening about these things. My final question is, who would you like to platform?
I think you and your listeners would really benefit from hearing from Ramez Naam. Mez is a guy that I met a while ago. I was selling my company and he was working at Microsoft and he was on the buying end. And he was kind of like a normal kind of tech nerd in the techie world. And then he just quit and went off and wrote some sci-fi books. And that became really popular. I think they're called the Nexus series or something. And it's all about this neural implants and all this kind of stuff. But he went on to basically be a climate thinker type. And he's so interesting to talk to. I think you will and he's very, very knowledgeable on what's going on in the climate arena in particular, but just the tech world in general. So I would platform.
Thank you so much for your time and for, coming on and having a conversation that we were more at loggerheads in Granada, I have to say.
Well, I think there was probably a few more beers involved.
But this is really great. Thank you so much for coming.
You too. Thanks so much for having me. This has been really fun.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.